Today I'm going to continue talking about India, the subcontinent. Why do they call it the subcontinent? Well, at least one author states that because you have the Himalayas and other mountain ranges that are in line with the Himalayas, Hindu Kush, something like that. Maybe that's not it, but other mountain range lined up with the Himalayas, starting from the same not platonic, same geo plates, whatever, smashing under the crust and lifting up and lifting down. You know what I'm talking about. The I don't want to say the platonic plates, which is not platonic. That's Plato. But and they're in line with the Himalayas. They stretch west, and K2 is in there, and so on. So this whole huge mountain range is kind of cuts along the northern border of India and separates it from the rest of Asia. So they call it the subcontinent. And as big as many of us think India is, its major length is 2,000 feet, which in my mind makes it not all that big. There's other countries that have much longer lengths, such as Russia, Canada, United States, and I'm going to say China, probably Brazil. So India is a little weak on length and size, but it's not weak on population by any stretch of the imagination. Anyway, so I'm trying to look into the ancient way of living in India, and let me start by saying that civilization was very homogenized, meaning no matter where you went, you got the same look, you got the same feel, you got the same way of living. So you could never feel ostracized. Well, you could feel ostracized if you were a lower caste and so on, untouchable. But you would never feel like you were not in your own country, no matter where you went. So, to start this brief discussion today, I'm going to start with the rituals and the ceremonies, particularly the rituals. Their days were filled with ritual. And the ritual usually was based on ancient, mostly religious texts, starting way back in Vedic times, which would have been pre-Hindu, which would have been many thousands of years BC. And let me interject here right now. I said, okay, let me find all the Indian dynasties and empires, and I'll run down that list. So I looked on the internet. There's got to be hundreds of them. So that's not going to happen. Suffice it to say, there were lots of Indian dynasties, Indian empires, kingdoms, all over the place. Not like in China, you got 7 or 8, and in Egypt you got 7 or 8. But hundreds, and they were obviously smaller, and there were, many existing at the same time. And one of the things I got from that list, which I thought was interesting, was one of the dynasties around, I'd say, the 4th century BC. At the time, this list promoted that dynasty was an empire, also empire dynasty, was the greatest on the planet at the time. And you know, that's saying a bunch. And it said that it had diplomatic relations with countries all over the place, including Greece and China and so on. But it was a well-known, well-regarded civilization. So my hunch that, this is years ago, my hunch was that the Indian, and many people ascribe to this theory, that the Indian culture had influence on early Christian thoughts and its religious philosophies and its, I don't want to say religious beliefs as much as I want to say religious living, religious life. This fact that India was promoting its culture in a vast sense means to me that it had to be influencing the parts of the Middle East that we associate the early days of Christianity with. And you know, there's the well-known story of St. Thomas, the disciple, taking a walkabout into India and probably coming back with certain information that he had gathered, if he came back at all, because he may have stayed there. The record's not clear for me yet. I know they talk about a community of Christians that was started up when St. Thomas was there. So, who knows? But certainly when you read their philosophy, the Vedic philosophies, they really have a lot of similarities with the Christians, their concepts of God and what's happening in the universe and so on. And the Indian philosophy is very strongly pacifist, and so is the Christian philosophy, pacifist. So anyway, getting back to what I was talking about, the day-to-day culture. First of all, let it be said that once a man got married, he became a central figure in a smallish community, being the family. And I think I said this before, that family could be comprised of up to 50 individuals. But, you know, there was his wife, probably mother-in-laws, sister-in-laws, brothers, children, aunts and uncles, the people who worked for him, their servants, their slaves, all in this compound that was the home, the house, and he became the central figure. So what's unique about that, in that culture, people, by merit of what we take for ordinary, in other words, just being married, but just that fact, they became significant characters on the stage of life, because that family compound mimicked the higher structures, the town government, the state government, the king government, and that newly married man found himself an important figure. Sure, in a smaller sense, but still, he was an important, revered, respected person in their culture. This is thousands of years ago. And a lot of that has trickled down to today, of course. They still adhere to many of these ritual customs. But he could be, and this was well accepted, he could be going along on his merry way, and his family was thriving and going along on its merry way, and everything was wonderful. And he could wake up one day and say, I'm going to become a hermit. I'm going to become an ascetic. and he got his begging bowl and his few strips of clothing, and he left the family, and he went a begging. Okay, this would of course cause the wife a great deal of sorrow and stress and anguish. But he had the right to do that because he was the top authority figure in that family community, and this was totally accepted. And what he was going to do, he was going to go out, be a hermit, and he was going to study the Vedic. He was going to study the scripture. He was going to study and become more holy. He was going to enhance his chances of avoiding having to recycle back as a human, but he would go straight to his heavenly rewards. And a lot of stuff that we talk about now sounds very similar to Christianity and its beliefs. So off he went. Now, he was a single hermit walking around, with his stick and his begging bowl and his robe. And he would be just one individual. He might hook up with another individual. Over time, maybe there will be 6 or 7 of them walking around together and so on. At some point, with the numbers increasing in their little crowd, they saw a need to perhaps build a shelter of some sort. And this they did. And as expected, with humans, of course, the shelter had to get bigger and bigger until the shelter turned into a monastery, and the monastery turned into its own little life force with hundreds, if not thousands, of monks, all imitating the rest of civilization. And what strikes me as odd is that they eventually get to a point where these monasteries become super big deals and super covered with art and sculpture and all sorts of beautiful painting, beautiful ceramics, just a wonderful, wonderful place. And I'm saying to myself, but this is exactly what they wanted to get out of their life. They wanted to get to where it was very simple, and they were strictly holy people, and they would, increase their chances of going directly to heaven. That strikes me as odd, and yet that's what it did. And of course, they tried to put a religious motive behind this. These wonderful paintings on the walls, they would bring in the lay people and they would instruct them by pointing to aspects of the paintings. And those paintings, of course, were religious paintings and scenes from the Vedic, and all of this, be going from simple to grandiose, the instruction by the paintings in the place, and the laity not being versed in the ability to read the Vedics. Some of them weren't even allowed to. Only certain castes could read the Vedics, and Sanskrit was not allowed to be spoken by the lower caste. I mean, there was all these restrictions. So the laity, they take them in, they point to it, and they tell them, this was this God and that God. And just like we got in the Catholic churches and in other places, and that was the reason. This was supposed to give a visual presentation of the Stations of the Cross, a visual presentation of the birth of Jesus in the manger. Now, I'm going to Catholicism, but I'm saying, so this is what they did with their monasteries, getting completely away from that simple aesthetic or whatever life of a hermit. So, humans can't help themselves, I guess. They just got to increase and increase and increase. That's what they got to do. So he would do that. And what's interesting too is that he could at any time say, "That's it. I'm going back to my house, and I'm going to take off where I left." The men back then had a lot of privileges compared to the women. The women had their rights, but the men had all sorts of privileges. What they could do and not do. Well, what they could do, period. And the wealthier ones had tremendous ability to live way above everybody else, and with all sorts of simple vices like gambling and too many women and too much wine and so on. Well, I don't know about too much wine, but a little bit of drinking. And the men, the women, like I said, they had certain abilities to do certain things, but this is ordinary life. Now, and remember, this is all over that big continent or subcontinent, all over that big land. Anywhere you went, whether it was a tiny village, a small town, a small city, this was the culture they were living, and they tended to imitate the well-off. The best situation was you were living in the big state where the prince or the king lived, and you were living right near that fella's estate, and you imitated it as much as you could. It certainly sounds very familiar, but we have a tendency to think that these ancient civilizations are way in the past, and in reality they're still going on in our minds. I think we still live in them a little bit. Like I brought up the fact that they were pacifists, and they were, but their leaders had numerous wars, and it doesn't rush off the average history page like it does when you read about China or Central Asia. You read about those two civilizations, and it's all about warfare. But in India, it doesn't talk about that, but they had their wars and their confrontations. And I haven't really dived into that, but one that I am aware of, the Gupta, G-U-P, something T-A, the Gupta dynasty, empire. I'm slaughtering that word. Gupta, but anyway. I think we're talking maybe 300 BC out to, I don't know, 400 or 500 BC. 500, not 80. So a pretty long period of time. And they did a lot of warring. First of all, they were large, and they were situated up against the western path or pass into India, that being the same path that Alexander the Great took on his way into India, essentially going through Iran, Afghanistan, and down the Indian coast, Pakistan, which didn't really have a Pakistan at that time. So, and they were constantly needing to defend themselves from the raiders coming from that area. As a matter of fact, they were one of the few empires that successfully turned back the Huns. So they must have been a fairly powerful force, military force, the Gupta Indian dynasty. And from what I read, I think they even pushed out beyond and conquered parts of Central Asia and even maybe a little bit into the Middle East. So they had their military might, and they succeeded. They also, besides going east to west, they also went south along the east coast of India, and they successful, and then they just passed on, and the so much changed when the British colonists came into that country that, and I enjoyed reading about that for a long time. So my whole idea and impression of India was colonial India, not this India, which is their culture. They were living it all at the same time the Brits were trying to rule them. They were still living their culture. But you don't get any feel for that when you're reading about the colonial history. It's all about the British Raj. It's all about the viceroy and the civil service over there. But fortunately or unfortunately, that only lasted for 300 or 400 years, if that much, and then it all went away. Certainly more to say on ancient India. The wedding ceremonies and ritual were very complex. Just getting the match made was complex. Certain things had to be certain ways, and then the wedding itself was a big deal. And in reading about how these folks dressed back then, I got the idea, the feeling that the men essentially wore a white garment wrapped around them and with some sort of a turban. The women probably wore some sort of wrap, but it could be colorful with the shawl around their head. So that's basically how they dressed. It was fairly plain. But when it came to the wedding, oh man, all stops were pulled out, and I think they still do today. Very colorful, very colorful, and the amount of ceremony is over the top. Who touches what food with what finger, who touches what earlobe with what finger, so on and so forth. Who comes in first, who comes in last, So the wedding ritual was over the top big, and when it was all over, they went back to the bridegroom's house that he had arranged for his new status in life, being married, and that was the beginning of a new family, a new step, and and so much of the married life was conducted by ritual. I mean, they didn't do anything without saying a prayer first. Everything was a prayer, and those prayers were based on the scripture. Just like was being done in early Christianity, prayers before you ate, and prayers for this and prayers for that. Same thing in the Indian culture. Once again, seeming to me, a very close connection. But you talk about the weddings, you talk about what happens when the child is first born, certain things, I think they blew some stuff in the kid's mouth. The attending physician would do that, all sorts of things. And the concept of a doctor coming in to help when somebody was sick was another tremendously ritualistic adventure. All things had to be done in precise ways, and it was a mixture of some sort of observable, I don't want to say scientific, but at least an awareness of what happens when you use certain herbs, when you use certain techniques at healing fractures or sore muscles. These were observable facts, and they applied them. But they also applied magic. So that doctor would do do both the magic and the getting to a certain technical and scientific expertise. Nothing like today, but it was a little of it. If you took this powder from this thing and that thing, and you gave it to somebody, it might be helpful for stomach aches. So the doctors were moving towards that. So the next thing that you really start to think of after you thought of getting married, having children, people being sick, was death. And it would be the person dying. Usually they talk about men. The person dying would say, okay, I'm going to die. And then everything stopped. They call the priests, they call the relatives, everybody. And they took the dying man and he put him on the ground outside so that he could start to reoccupy his place in the universe. And he would sit there until he died. Then he dies, and then the next big rituals start, with the how they wrap him, what they bathe him in, this and that and the other thing. And then how they ceremoniously take him to the cremation site. Because in ancient India, many of the people were cremated. And of course, along with the cremation came the, when women jump in the flames. Sutra, I don't have it right now. But the women would climb up on that scaffold where the man was burning, and she would allow herself, the wife, allow herself to be burned to death. And then, once the flames were down, excuse me, I'm going to cough. Once the flames were out, they let that corpse stay on that scaffold for about 10 days. And what this would do, the bones would cool, and any remaining flesh would get pecked away by the birds of prey. Then they can go collect the bones and do whatever they did with the bones. I'm not sure if they just chopped them up and made them into a powder or something like that. But I think they brought them back to their house and put them in a jar and buried it. Once again, not behaviors, the cremation, certainly not an unknown behavior in today's day and age. The jumping into the fire, that is not going on anymore. So, ancient India, many strange to us, rituals, ceremonies. But they seem in many ways to be like us in some of the things we do, particularly in entertainment. They like the good festival. And in those festivals, often in association with the temples and the monasteries, and even perhaps the palaces, they would have theatrical productions. And when I was reading about these theatrical productions, I felt I was reading about Shakespeare's time. I was reading about, stage managers. I was reading about the troupe. I was reading about the difficulties of maintaining a troupe of actors and actresses. There wasn't a lot of money to be made all the time, sometimes maybe, but all this had to be paid for, all this had to be organized. And I said, this was what the Shakespearean and Elizabethan troupes were up against. And quite frankly, acting companies of today, they're all up against this sort of thing. And you've heard of the term where a particular person gets known to be the type to take a certain type of role in whatever he's doing, whatever he's playing, and that's these actors and actresses back then. That's what they did. They specialized. This guy maybe was a villain, another guy was maybe a prince, and so on. They specialized, and maybe it made it easier for them to put on a production. Didn't have to learn so much, but they specialized, and it was a very popular entertainment, very popular. The people were in the place where they were going to have the play way before it would even start. They would love to watch them, get ready for it. It's a very popular entertainment. Of course, they didn't have much to entertain society in those days. So they would any entertainment they could get, and at these festivals, they would have them all. They would have magicians, they would have snake charmers, they would have people who could do all sorts of tricks, including like making a tree grow out of a little nut, and some guys jumping out of the tree, and this and that and the other thing. I think I read about some of that in Kipling's stories. I think they call them fakers, Fakars. But and if that's the case that I did, then, and Kipling was writing what was going on in the 18th and 19th century. And what I'm talking about was going on in 300 BC and 200 AD, and so on. So you can see the continuity there too. At some point in time, though, I would like to delve into the political aspects of ancient India. I'm apt to believe that it's going to be the same sort of court drama that we get everywhere else. You get these people of privilege, and you put them together in a room, and the same sorts of things are going to happen. But I'm going to look more. I'm being surprised every time I try to jump into Indian history. What I find, I don't find what I think I'm going to find. So that may be one of India's special charms, is that it has really hidden itself, its culture from us. And the idea of hiding your history is not a new or a singular concept, known only to a singular nation. Because certainly we read that the Mongols didn't like to advertise who they were. As a matter of fact, their well-known history is called The Secret History of the Mongols. So that concept could have spread in those contiguous worlds of Central Asia, India, China. I don't think China liked to spread who it was either. Smart kind of move, You don't want to publicize who you are, where you are, and how you are, because then your enemies are going to get you. More likely they'll get you. Well, listen, that's enough for today, I think. And thanks for listening. Hopefully we'll see you next time. All right.